Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe, authors or social critics? Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain are without a doubt two of the most famous authors in America. Everyone has heard of Poe and his Telltale Heart, and Twain and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. However, most of the time these two authors are not considered to be comparable to each other. While they are both prolific and heavily studied throughout elementary levels of English education, all the way through graduate levels of coursework, they are not often considered to be similar to each other in any way. In particular, Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain are not usually considered to be authors of the Gothic genre of literature. While Poe is unquestionably dark in his tales of misery and woe, Twain is usually more cheerful, or at the very least more realistic. The Gothic genre is not one that is associated with America, much less the American South. The scenery surrounding a Gothic tale usually involves dark castles in Spain or France, while the story itself often involves elements of the supernatural, incest, mystery, and all-around gloom. Certainly some elements of Edgar Allan Poe's stories can be considered gloomy and dark, most notably the Telltale Heart, the Raven, or the Cask of Amontillado, but are more often than not written about some place in America. Mark Twain, on the other hand, writes stories about the American South, telling stories of the essential moments in history that shaped our world, and is in no way seemingly part of the Gothic genre. However, both of these authors fall into a subgenre of the Gothic, American Southern Gothic, where in the main Gothic genre the setting is a dark, gloomy castle in Europe. The setting in American Southern Gothic is often a family plantation in the South. The setting in this genre is crucial to adding the overall meaning and feeling of the story. For these two authors, part of what makes them instrumental in the American Southern Gothic genre is the political and social commentary that runs throughout their stories. Both authors use their storytelling to tell a bigger story, that of the political and social failings in their society. In Mark Twain's novella Pudd'nhead Wilson, the story revolves around a young slave woman named Roxy who tries to save her child by switching him with the child of her master. Because Roxy herself is only part black, her son, Chambers, looks remarkably like Tom, the son of Roxy's master. The irony comes to play when Chambers, who believes he is Tom, grows into a horrible person, while Tom, believing himself to be the Black Chambers, grows into a caring man. One of the biggest questions surrounding Twain's novella is whether or not Twain wrote it as a racist novella or an argument against the racism of the time. In Myra Jellen's article, The Ties That Bind, Race and Sex in Pudd'nhead Wilson, the author argues that Twain may have been reluctant to see black men acquire the power of whites and may have viewed their bid for a share of power as outright usurpation. But he did not vindicate white society. She concludes this argument by saying that, like many of Twain's other work, Pudd'nhead Wilson ends in a stalemate between radical criticism and an implicit conservatism in the refusal or the inability to imagine significant change. So while this novella at the beginning has a feeling of being an anti-racism novel, with Roxy switching her son and the son of the master in order to prevent her son from being sold downriver, we soon come to realize that there is more to the story that Twain is attempting to portray. As Tom and Chambers grow older, their differences become what could be crucial to the story. Jellen makes an interesting argument about the role of sex in the story. She suggests that in Roxy, Twain endorses a black woman's subversion of the white patriarchy. In Tom, he rejects a black man's takeover. If the story was simply that of Roxy switching out her baby for a white one in order to save her own, the story would call in question the domestic ideology of white womanhood, because Roxy would be exercising authority of motherhood in a white society. However, with Tom taking the place of the white man, Twain is considering the usurpation of authority of white fatherhood connotation of a global reversal. So now one must consider not just whether Twain is writing a racist story or not, but a sexist one as well. Jalen also makes an argument about the role sex and race play when combined. She comments, black men are seen simultaneously as excessively male and insufficiently masculine. She says that Tom is entangled in these contradictions because while his final act is a stabbing at an earlier point in the story, he robs houses disguised as a woman. While Tom is entangled in both, Chambers is forced into this insufficiently masculine role because at the end of the story, after being integrated back into white society, he finds it hard to be comfortable in any place other than the kitchen, a place that is usually suited, by means of social regulations, for a woman. The argument confuses the racism question in Twain's story even more because it is not only portraying women in a negative light, but also black men in a negative light as well. Clearly, Twain is trying to make some argument about the politics and social rules of this culture, but it is unclear as to what that argument is. While the novella can be read from both perspectives, racist or not racist, it seems that ultimately the argument that is being made is not necessarily about race or gender, but about the role of society. Allan makes another argument, saying, however exchangeable the mistakable physical characteristics of blacks and whites, they represent how apparent likeness can mask real and profoundly different beings. Initially, clothing and social status are seen as hiding real human resemblance. It is because of society and the rules of society that Chambers and Tom become who they are. Tom is thrown into the white culture, the status of being a wealthy white man and wears fancy white man clothing, therefore he becomes white. Chambers, alternatively, becomes black once he is thrown into the black society, the black status and the black clothing. The society created the rules of how they were expected to behave, so the boys became the expected character. Mark Twain is making the argument that it is society that is corrupt, and it is not just one side of race or gender or the other that is corrupt. Society as a whole instills the ideas of how to behave, how to dress, who to be, therefore making a negative impact on the minorities of that society. We have established that most of the time, Pudd'nhead Wilson is more often than not considered to be an anti-racist novel. This argument is solidified in Lee Clark Mitchell's article, De Nigger and You, Race or Training in Pudd'nhead Wilson, when the author states, most readers have read the novel as a direct indictment of slave society, one in which racial prejudice alone accounts for two babies' separate developments. Yet readers also hold the two accountable for their behavior in life, which introduces a contradiction. Tom seems absolved of responsibility for acting in ways he is trained to prefer, but is still presumed guilty of the shoddy and final criminal acts he performs. Likewise, a contradiction exists in the perspective maintained toward the racism of Dawson's Landing. Even as innate traits are narratively ridiculed, they do have genuine consequences. Events result from inherited characteristics no less than from social training, and thereby apparently a buttress of a racial myth that is everywhere else undermined. This argument again brings into consideration that Twain was not necessarily arguing for or against racism, but was arguing against the societal rules that created a hostile environment. Mitchell says that events result from inherited characteristics no less than from social training, and thereby apparently buttress a racial myth that is everywhere else undermined. The idea that society is responsible for the inherited characteristics further emphasizes that it is not just the fact that Tom and Chambers are black and white, but the society expected them to be something in particular. Had Chambers remained as a black slave baby, he would have become what he was supposed to. Society was responsible for making Tom and Chambers what they became. While these two critics considered the argument to be largely based against societal rules, Chapter 10 of the Mark Twain section of the Twain's Author Series online seems to consider it in a different way. While John Gerber still considers it to be about society, it is not just any society, but especially a society that accepts slavery. For the first time in his fiction, Mark Twain confronts the slaveholding South head-on. And given his fast-rising cynicism in the 1890s, he sees such a culture, despite his nostalgic memories of it, as the ultimate absurdity of human existence. Anticipating such writers as Joseph Heller and Kurt Vonnegut, he creates a world in which irrationality is the norm and humor the offspring of irony. On the surface, there is a devil-may-care attitude about implausibilities and unabashed use of stock in situations, and an undisguised manipulation of material for melodramatic tableau at the ends of chapters. The characters seem to exist primarily to suggest the idiocy of human behavior. There is only one of them, Roxana, for whom the reader develops any sympathy or even concern. Yet in its crazy way, the book becomes a sermon on the hopelessness of a society that accepts slavery. By creating only one character with whom readers can empathize, Twain is putting the reader into the role of society. The reader, condemning both Chambers and Tom and empathizing with only Roxy, characterizes the hopelessness of a society that accepts slavery. The reader, therefore, becomes the hopeless society, putting Chambers and Tom into situations that neither can overcome, much like those put into slavery and unable to become free, simply because they are 1/16 black. Again, the argument about training and society becomes important, with Gerber saying, a grimmer aspect of life in Dawson's Landing is that no one, white or black, has any significant personal freedom. The blacks are simply chattel, subject to their owner's whims. Although their work seems not too onerous, there is always the threat of being sold down the river to a big plantation that scares them witless and keeps them in line. Less obvious, but just as exacting, is the enslavement of the whites by their economic and social systems. Not only are the black characters enslaved, but the white population is also enslaved by the societal rules and expectations. Even if a person felt inclined to protect or free a slave, the society they are enslaved by will not allow such a thing to occur. Both blacks and whites alike are enslaved by society, according to Mark Twain. Like Mark Twain, Edgar Allan Poe can be considered a critic of society. Though Twain is writing about the enslavement of both white and black in society and the rules it instills, in Poe's story, The Cask of Amontillado, there is a sense of criticism over the idea of class in the time period. According to Elena V. Barabin's article, Motive for Murder in The Cask of Amontillado, the mystery of the story comes not from who done it, but why did he do it. The narrator tells the story 50 years later and feels no atonement for what he has done. Barabin's article tells us, Scott Peoples quotes Montresor in support of the argument about Montresor's bad conscience. 50 years later, he still remembers his heart's growing sick, on account of the dampness of the catacombs, but his heart sickness likely arises from empathy towards his victim. In fact, it is one of the numerous instances of irony in Poe's text. Charles May notes in this regard, even if our hypothesis that Montresor tells the story as a final confession is correct, the tone or manner of his telling makes it clear that he has not atoned, for he enjoys himself in the telling too much, as much in fact as he did when he committed the crime itself. Indeed, the dash in the middle of the sentence indicates a pause. When Montresor pronounces the first part of the phrase, the reader may believe that Montresor begins to feel sorry for the poor Fortunato. But when the narrator concludes that his heart is growing sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs, it becomes clear that Montresor feels satisfaction about his monstrous deed even after 50 years. The narrator is still confusing the reader and making it unclear as to why he killed Fortunato. However, not only does Montresor feel no guilt for what he has done, he seems to show some satisfaction in what he has done. Interestingly, Barabin allows an idea that part of the motive for Montresor to kill Fortunato lies in the fact that he is not as high up in the society as he is. Barabin argues that a number of onomastic and semantic characteristics of the text indicate that the Cask of Amontillado is a story about the characters' power relations and their social status. She maintains that Fortunato can remember neither the coat of arms nor the motto of the Montresors. The display of family insignia was an indispensable part in the life of a socially prominent nobleman. Since a rich and powerful man such as Fortunato cannot remember the Montresors' insignia, it is logical to assume that Montresor was not an active participant in the life of local aristocracy. Because Montresor realized that Fortunato was not a true participant of the local aristocracy, it seems that he felt a need to remedy the situation. It is likely that even though Fortunato came by his fortunes on his own, rather than through family fortune, Montresor felt threatened because he was not as wealthy or powerful as his enemy, but felt that because his family had been a part of the aristocracy for years, he should therefore maintain power over Fortunato despite his lack of wealth compared to him. This power struggle over being the better aristocrat characterizes Edgar Allan Poe's political and social criticisms. While Twain is a social critic on the society's enslavement of white against black, Poe is criticizing the aristocracy and the power it has to trap people in their status in society. Both Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain use their stories and their eloquent writing abilities to not just entertain their readers, but also to create a social commentary and criticize that which they do not agree with. Despite the fact that Poe came from a decent family, his story implies distaste for the aristocracy and the class system, and even though Twain came from the South, his novella creates an uncertainty over what is actually enslaving society.